There we go. Okay. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I know that this is also the same night as the Spotlight finale, so we moved our time up 30 minutes, so I'm sure people are starting already. It's usually 7:30 stuff. But we wanted to make it possible for people that wanted to do both to be able to do this. So you'll be done by 8 o'clock. If you're a Spotlight fan, you can make it done. So that first tune featured a couple of different, see, Aaron Barnes on the alto saxophone. When he got here, one of the first things he did is like, hey, can we do gospel, John? Can we do gospel, John? Can we do gospel, John? And I was just like, no, maybe not. And then this year I was like, okay, we're going to do gospel, John. So the story behind this is the guy that made this kind of popular among the jazz audience. This guy named Maynard Ferguson. He was a trumpet player that was popular back in the 70s and 80s. He was, kind of his thing was he was really good at doing the high note stuff, right? And the trumpet player was just like, oh, high notes. But he became, really well known for doing that. But the other thing that he did was he put together bands that were just killer bands. And they wouldn't do just, the typical jazz stuff. They would do a lot of things that were kind of, mainstream pop culture things, like when the movie Rocky came out, he did a cover of the Rocky theme and stuff like that. So he was very appealing. He was very charismatic and fun to watch on stage. So we're going to have Hayden. He's going to do his Maynard Ferguson stuff at the top here, and then we're going to play gospel. So here we go. Hey, Ethan, was that your first solo with the jazz band? All right. All right. We're going to continue on with a tune called Orange Shirt. This particular one is going to feature our trumpet instructor who just got back from New York City playing, you played on the Stephen Colbert show, right? And what was the other one? Kelly Clarkson show. I mean, that was the place the band called The Word Treatment. They played all over the country. A couple summers ago, he was just like, yeah, look where I am. It was a Radio City Music Hall, and he played like Red Box a couple years ago. So it's very cool. Anyway, this is going to feature Joe on the trumpet. This is called Orange Shirt. So one of the things I like to do when I've had a student that's been in the ensemble over several semesters, is give them a chance to be featured, especially if it's like a senior year kind of thing. And that's the case with this next one. So Jared came just a few summers ago and said, hey, I'd like to come to Cumberland. I'm a bass player. And we're like, well, don't really have a bass thing, but we'll try to make it work out. And so he has been in all the different ensembles and played in marching band, played in concert band, played in the jazz band, of course, and has just been just a wonderful student to work with. So we wanted to give him a chance to be featured on this particular one. This is called Touching All the Bases. And I'm stalling a little bit because he has to set up a different stall for a second while he hooks back up his other bass. Let's give him another hand for that. So if you remember my concerts, you'll occasionally see me referring to my metronome on my phone. And I was talking to Mr. Jordan before, no, so I was talking to Dwayne, Dr. Jordan, before the concert. And I was talking about years ago, I got kind of nerves got going, and I kicked off this chart, and it was way too fast. And the trombone players' eyes all got really big because they had some really good stuff. So every so often, if I don't trust myself, I'll pull out the metronome check to make sure. So, speaking of Dr. Warfield, I want to recognize the people that are sitting in with us this evening to kind of help fill out some of the sections that maybe we didn't have. So Dr. Warfield, Dr. Tony Warfield, our band director. And in the trumpet section, Ori introduced you to Judge Jordan down there on the end. On this end of the trumpet section is Drew Shannon, one of our graduates who's now teaching in Plastica. And next to Mr. Jordan is Noah Mullins, who is a student of Drew's at Jackson Area in Placer County, and he came up to join us today too. So let's give him a hand. And then later we're going to bring Miss McGinley out. She's going to play with me. So I appreciate all of them for helping us to fill out the ensemble because it makes a huge difference. Poor Hayden this semester. A lot of times we'll have 2 or 3 or 4 trumpet players in jazz ensemble, but for some reason this particular semester, class conflicts and things of that nature, this was the only trumpet player, and I said this will not stand. We'll have a trumpet section for the concert. So I appreciate it. We're going to play the next 2 called Big Cup of Sugar. actually had a couple of arrangements of some small tunes that we thought would work really well. We decided to go with this one. I think you will really enjoy this. This is by Sarah Willis, and it's called Mayhem. Let's have another hand for Sharon. So when I decided I was going to hire the mercenary trumpet section to come in for this, I wanted to give them something to kind of, sink their teeth into. And that's this next trumpet. This is called a brass machine, and it's got some regular parts for the trumpets, and I think you'll enjoy it. So this is a brass machine. tin on this tune. Jacob Green on the drums. Time 7:44. Okay, we got to play this last tune so you can go see spots. This is Afghanistan. Thanks again for coming out. We really appreciate it.